I think we can all agree that Liberty City Stories is a really solid game and that it manages to do a lot of things right despite all the hardware limitations it had to face. But we can also agree that one of its weaker points is the storyline. It's not as if the weaker plot makes the game bad by any means, but there are a few aspects of the story that I would personally change to make it a lot better. My issues with this game stem from the lack of direction we have in the game, as we have no real goal in the story. Similar to GTA 3, we're dealing with gangs, mafia families, and the wars that take place between them for power, money, and influence. But this time around, we're in the shoes of Tony Cipriani, a member of the Leones, and because of this, the game features a much more prominent mob theme to the story. It's not too far-fetched to say that both classic movies like Goodfellas, The Godfather, and even TV shows like The Sopranos had a bigger influence on this game than what we saw in GTA 3. Considering the dynamic between Tony Cipriani and his mother, you can clearly see the resemblance to the dynamic between Tony Soprano and his mother. Rockstar took a different approach, where the main focus is the rise to power of the Leones, and Tony's personal journey of becoming a made man, and later, Salvatore's right-hand man. And along that journey, we're working for different associates of the Leones in order to prove ourselves both to Salvatore and Ma Cipriani. Now, since the game's main focus and theme is that of a mob story, it's somewhat understandable that Tony's goal isn't necessarily to be the most powerful and rich guy in all of Liberty City, but rather to aid Salvatore in his plan to give the Leones a name for themselves on the streets of Liberty, as they have to deal with more than just the other two families in the city, those being the Forellis and the Sindacos, but also other gangs like the Diablos, the Triads, and the Yakuza. So what's my issue with the story if the real goal isn't that of gaining power for ourselves, but rather for the Leones as a family? Well, the lack of a proper antagonist is my main drawback. If you've seen any of my previous videos, you know I've mentioned more than once that my only problem with LCS as a game was how the antagonists were handled in the story. It's not as if they're bad and poorly written, but they're very much underutilized within the plot. Let's first talk about the main villain of the game. Anyone's got a clue who that might be? Well, if you have paid attention to the game, you might not even know who that is until the very last mission. The main antagonist is Massimo Torini. He's the boss of the Sicilian mob, and technically he's more of an antagonist to Salvatore than he is to Tony. But since I've mentioned how the focus isn't necessarily on Tony as a character, but rather on the Leones as a whole, it would have been fine as a pick for the main villain, had he been more involved in the story. His presence on screen and the amount of dialogue he has during those appearances is abysmally low. We can only see Torini featured in 2 out of the game's 70 total missions. And what's even worse than that is the fact that he has about 4, maybe 5 lines of dialogue in total. So he barely even speaks, and he's not directly seen for the majority of the game's duration. So how can we even consider him a proper fit for the game's main antagonist role? I even went so far as to rank him on the very last spot back when I did a tier list ranking of all the main villains in the GTA series. And I don't think you can really argue with me here. I cannot see someone else in the franchise taking that spot. But if you were to disagree with me, I can definitely see a few points you could make in his favor. But I'll list all of them for you and even dismantle them. First and foremost, you could argue that Torini isn't the only villain we've had in the series that was only seen 2, maybe 3 times in total, and yet they were really loved by the fans of the respective games. And that's true. One of my top 3 games in the franchise is Vice City, and Sonny Forelli, who is without a doubt the main villain of that game, is only seen 3 times on screen. So just like Torini, we don't see Sonny all that much in the game, yet he's the main villain and fans of the game really like him as a character. And although I didn't rank him that much higher than Torini, I agree with people considering him an overall decent villain. But see, Sonny is basically putting pressure on Tommy's shoulders from the get-go, and although his presence isn't physical for the majority of the story, his constant phone calls, which get more and more aggressive as we progress, play a good role in cementing Sonny as the real threat that's out there, and that he could come at any point to check in on things and possibly take out Tommy's businesses as well as Tommy himself. He's the boss of the Forellis after all, so he's not just coming down on his own, he's also bringing in a lot of his men with him. This creates the sense of a real threat, and one that's not really easy to get rid of and escape. What I'm trying to get at here is that Sonny's lack of direct appearances don't put him on the same level as Torini, because Sonny is directly related to Tommy, and the dynamic between them is one of rivalry, as Tommy is now a mob boss himself and has got loose from under the thumb of the Forellis, whereas Torini, who does influence some things off screen and is responsible for a lot of the trouble Salvatore goes through, he's not directly related to Tony in any way. He's merely a main villain for us because he's the one causing the Leones trouble as a whole. Perhaps more implication from Torini's side would have helped to make things more interesting. For example, what if similar to Sonny's constant reminders to Tommy about giving him back the money he's owed, we received a few phone calls from Torini throughout the game. But what would those phone calls even consist of? Well, since Tony manages to prove himself to Salvatore and is directly responsible for a lot of the major events that happen in the storyline, like taking out Mayor Roger C. Hole, then working with Donald Love and aiding him in his campaign to become the next mayor, and also destroy the entirety of Fort Staunton in the process. Tony is Salvatore's biggest asset, and without his direct help, the situation would have been a lot worse for him. But what if throughout the game we received a few phone calls from Torini with him asking us to switch sides and join him? Since Tony would definitely be of very good use to him in his plan to take over the city and get rid of Salvatore and the other mob families. It might sound underwhelming, but even just a few extra lines of dialogue, preferably directly spoken to Tony, would have made things a lot better, as Torini is the only antagonist in the history of GTA villains to never directly speak to the protagonist. Which is insane, and not the good kind of insane. But perhaps we wouldn't even need Torini to beg us to join his side. Just one or two phone calls where he simply threatens us and the people we work for would have been just fine. At least it would feel as if there's a real threat out there to get us, and someone to feel resent towards. Although there's a certain someone else that could have served as a much better antagonist than Torini. I'm of course talking about Vincenzo. He's technically a villain and a really solid one at that, however his appearance in the game was cut short and the writers handled him really poorly. And that's unfortunate, because he would have definitely been a great antagonist had he not been killed 1/3 into the game's story. And not only was he killed off seemingly random, his death isn't even acknowledged by anyone in the game. Not even Salvatore, which is very strange to say the least, because when we start off the game, Vincenzo is Salvatore's capo and he even runs his own crew. So he's definitely an important figure in the hierarchy of the Leones, yet after his death occurs, no mention of his character is ever heard in the game. Not really sure why that was the case. Maybe a situation similar to Ryder's character in GTA San Andreas happened, where the initial plans were very different, but things had to be scrapped and changed, which resulted in a weaker plot point. However, this could simply be the case of the developers and writers making a poor choice and eliminating a great villain too early for no apparent reason. But no matter what the case was, I'm going to do some speculation and present two possible what-if scenarios where Vincenzo is a much more relevant character and he basically becomes the main villain of the game, replacing Torini almost entirely. Both of these hypothetical what-if scenarios obviously involve Vincenzo staying alive all the way until the game's final mission, for him to serve as the real villain in Tony's storyline. But before diving into those two possible plot changes, let me explain why Vincenzo is a better fit for the role of the main antagonist instead of Torini. We've already established that LCS's theme is that of a mob story, so the protagonist is also the Leone family and Salvatore's involvement is very important. What you see, that doesn't excuse Rockstar creating a really good character that is meant to be Tony's direct rival, make him real unlikable and annoying, and have no choice but to work for him, then at one point make him screw us over, and finally out of nowhere randomly have him set us up, which ends with us taking him out. Vincenzo is written really well, and the dynamic between him and Tony is set up from the very first mission. We're forced to work for him, he acts superior and treats us like crap, and there's no real way to escape that because, again, he's a capo. He would have definitely been much better off if he was set up to be the main antagonist, instead of poofing him out of existence and never mentioning him again. The two possible rewritings of the story I'm going to present obviously include him, and either of them would have made the game's story leagues better than what we received in the end. The first possible what-if scenario is somewhat unrealistic, but definitely much better than the current plot we have, and it even involves Torini, so as to have each of our most important characters, those being Tony and Salvatore, each have their own antagonist to deal with. This new and much better plot point would obviously skip over Vincenzo's early death in the game, and would instead follow the normal plot up until maybe when Salvatore is incarcerated. There, it would be revealed that we had a rat that was feeding information to the Sicilians, and we're now on a quest to find out who that is. And you'd never guess who that rat might be. Of course it's Vincenzo, who was approached by Torini and offered him a much more important role in his family, or perhaps he would have let Vincenzo run the show in Liberty for him after his unsuccessful attempts at turning Tony to his side. But why would it be unrealistic, you might say? Vincenzo is a slimeball and he's betrayed Tony like it's nothing, but since at the time Tony wasn't even a made guy and therefore not a very important member of the Leones, screwing him over wouldn't be necessarily a big deal, but betraying the family as a whole is a very different thing. I'm sure he would be willing to sell out anybody in order to maintain his position, but he seems to truly respect or at the very least fear Salvatore enough for him to know his limits. so this hypothetical scenario isn't really plausible, but I'd still take it over what we got in the actual game. Now, let's move on to the second possible scenario, and that would be simply to keep Vincenzo somewhat involved in the story, but keep him more off-screen in the second act of the game, similar to Sonny. In this alternate version of the storyline, Vincenzo is kept alive and he's witnessing how he's slowly being replaced as Salvatore's right-hand man, as Tony is doing the real legwork around the family and is directly responsible for keeping the show running. This would then make Vincenzo feel really threatened and cornered, as Salvatore could possibly get rid of him or simply make Tony the new capo, which did eventually happen anyway. But with this dynamic set into place, it would make things much better. Fearing the possibility of losing his power in the family, Vincenzo could set up Tony just like he did in the mission Portland Chainsaw Masquerade, but this time, instead of being a way for Vincenzo to get back at Tony for being given the finger, it would be as a way to get rid of Tony for threatening his position in the family and making sure he remains Salvatore's lapdog. However, this hypothetical scenario can also play out into a third way, where this time Vincenzo might simply attempt to take out Salvatore on his own, so that he could end up replacing him as the boss. Not sure if that would really play out well in the game without feeling a bit forced, but again, I would still take this over what we got in the actual plot. But beyond rewriting the antagonists we already have, why not involve other characters to make up for the lack of goals we have in this game? As you all know, if there's one thing that Tony truly cares for is his own mother, Ma Cipriani. Similar to GTA 3, we don't directly see her and only hear her voice.
Tony Cipriani here.
Tony, it's your ma. I just heard you've been made. I never doubted you for a second, son. And seeing as how you're finally proving yourself, I'm calling off that contract I put on you. Let's just put it behind us. After all, I only did it with your best interest at heart. What kind of a son makes his ma go to such lengths? See you soon, son. Don't forget about your old ma.
Apart from that one phone call you just heard, every other interaction we see is her calling Tony weak and nothing like his father, who was a real man in her eyes. All the missions we do for her are Tony's way to prove to his mother that he's a real man and would do anything for her. From taking out triad members, to taking pictures of Casa in a particularly interesting outfit, to then even getting rid of him and anyone else Ma Cipriani considers a better man than Tony. The actions he does, although very sick and twisted, proves he's got more depth to his character than others we see in this game. So if you took either of Vincenzo or Torini and made them harm Ma Cipriani in any way, this would really set Tony on a rampage like never before, and would make it feel like Tony's got a real purpose this time around, getting back the thing he cares about and making sure his mother is safe. You can't really argue with that, since Tony's mother is the only other person besides Salvatore he respects. Her character being in danger because of the main antagonist would set up a proper revenge arc without taking away from the mob theme that the game is following. Instead of just complaining about the writing, I thought it would be much better to create not one, but multiple ways the storyline of LCS could have played out differently to make it heaps better than what it is. Again, I cannot stress this enough, I really love playing LCS and I consider it one of the most underrated games in the entire GTA franchise. But just because I love this game doesn't mean I cannot see the issues it has. And it's because I love the game so much that I'm willing to yap about the story for however long this video might end up being. If I had to pick and choose between all of the possible scenarios I've presented, I would definitely replace Massimo Torini with Vincenzo and have him go on a character arc where he feels like Tony is out to get him, and in retaliation, he discovers in some way that the only thing Tony holds dear to him is his own mother, and finds a way to get to her to then use that against him, perhaps to do his own bidding, and maybe even do a few more missions for him, or simply have him call us every once in a while to remind us that he's going to make a move soon or something along those lines. Besides the main villains, I would have definitely loved to see more returning characters from GTA 3, like Luigi, who's never seen in this game, to flesh them out properly and expand their backstories. The purpose of this video was more to let my imagination run free, but also to share my thoughts with all of you. But what do you think? Is the plot of Liberty City Stories fine just the way it is, or would you change it to one of the what-if scenarios I've presented? Maybe even one of your own. I would love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to start a discussion down in the comment section. And while you're there, also leave a like. And of course, consider subscribing if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching.